Hi, it's Kalia Hall Terrelli here, real estate investor coach in Washington, D.C. And today what I want to do is I want to take some time and talk about what is a double closing. That was one of the questions that came in earlier this week. So first of all, I'll explain a little bit about double closings and then get more into how it's used. But basically, double closing is when someone sells a house and there's two closings that are back to back. So you're buying a house from a seller. Let's say you want to wholesale the deal, and so you'll have closing number one, where the property is transferred from the homeowner to, let's say, a wholesaler, or actually the first buyer, buyer number one, and then there's a second closing where the property is transferred right after from buyer number one to buyer number two. So a lot of people, some people use these type of transactions where they want to wholesale real estate, and they don't want the seller to know that they're wholesaling it. Let's say, for instance, they don't want the wholesaler to see that there is another end buyer on the contract, because normally with a reassignment, what that does is basically just changes the name. So like when you get your HUD-1, when you go to settlement, the seller will see that there's a different person on there. Now, it's not always the case where the seller is going to see what you're making, because in that instance, the title attorney is the one that's cutting out your check. So when you have the HUD, it's not always possible for the seller to see what you're making. But again, you have to talk to the attorney that you're working with. Each state probably has their own laws and how they do their closing documents. So a lot of people like to do this again for wholesaling because they don't want the seller to know. They feel like the seller won't know that they're actually wholesaling it if they do what's called a double closing. So for this, you do have to have an attorney that's investor friendly. So you do have to have an attorney that knows what they're doing. And again, the main purpose of it is to kind of be anonymous, where the seller doesn't know that you're actually going to take that property and transfer it to somebody else. And so that's why people do this. But one of the main reasons that people do a double closing is not necessarily always because of that, because again, you do have to have, when you're buyer number one, a lot of times you do have to have the money to close on the first transaction. So if the property, if you're getting it for $50,000, you say it's all cash, and you need to have that $50,000 all cash to be able to close out the first transaction in order to transfer the deal to buyer number two. But people primarily use double closings, especially when they're buying bank-owned properties. That's just one tactic that people use. And the reason why they do this is because with the bank-owned properties, the bank doesn't allow for wholesale deals. So the bank doesn't allow for reassignment. So if you're buying a property from a bank, let's say it's a bank-owned property, you're buying it at the auction, whatever the case is, or you may be buying it, let's say, for a realtor's listed a property, but the banks do not allow for reassignment. So basically, normally they have you sign like some type of addendum saying that, you know, whoever's buying the property is going to be the end buyer, the person that's closing on it. So if you're wholesaling and you don't have any money, then you wouldn't be able to be the person that's going to close out the transaction. So that's why people would do this. So, I mean, that's in a nutshell what double closings are. Again, this is not legal advice, so definitely if you plan on going this route, you definitely want to speak to somebody that's an investor friendly attorney. And let's see, what else did I want to say about this one? I don't typically, I don't use, but definitely you do have to have the funding. So that's the key with this one, is that, you know, if you're wholesaling and you're not really working with a lot of funds, this one can be a hard one to take advantage of, because, I mean, some people, they go look for hard money. Again, the hard money, get into the high interest rates, and whether the hard money lender will even deal with you, knowing that you're just going to, you know, turn around and resell to somebody else. So a lot of people don't get so much into this one because you do have to have money. Oh, and the other thing that I did want to mention, this is what it was. I'm sorry, I just thought about it. The other thing with these double closings is that if somebody's coming in, let's say, for instance, you have this property and basically you're going to do a double closing. So that means that title has transferred like twice. So basically there's two closing on this one property on the same day. So a lot of times, like when that rehabber, let's say that the end buyer, that buyer number two is a rehabber, when they want to go and they want to sell the property to somebody else, there can be different issues. Like let's say if it's an FHA buyer or something like that, there can be seasoning issues. So that's another reason why people don't necessarily do this one so often, especially if they're in a market where people are using a lot of FHA loans. because they'll see that there's all these transfers. When that end buyer that's coming in, who's going to buy the property to live in, when they come in to buy the property, they'll see all these transfers on the title, and so that can cause an issue if somebody's getting an FHA loan, depending upon how quickly the property has changed hands. So definitely that's another thing to mention. A lot of people get around that one by buying like a corporation. I'll go over that one later on this week. But this one, today I just want to primarily focus on the double closing. So does anybody have any questions just about what a double closing is or anything in general about it? I can imagine, like, if you're just getting started, you're probably more so focused on maybe just regular assignments and wholesaling and things like that. Double closing is not something that a lot of new people look to execute. It's not that it's complicated. Typically, you just have to have an attorney that knows what they're doing, because when you're in, things aren't really going to look different. So when you're in, you're pretty much just looking for people who want to sell. You're getting it under contract. The only difference is, instead of you actually doing an assignment agreement, you're just going to do another contract and just transfer, do it like another contract with that second buyer. And then the documents get over. So it's more of a legal type of thing, but it really looks the same on the front end when you're dealing with sellers and things like that. And then the attorney is the one who really puts everything else together for you. So there's not much that's going to be required on your end, as long as you have the funds to close on that first transaction. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the comments, and I'll be sure to answer them. Okay. Well, I hope that everyone's gaining value from these videos, and if you are, I'd be happy if you could invite others into the group or share these videos with others. Let's see. Well, the attorney, they're going to have their typical cost. So the other thing is the transfer and recordation and those type of things. So that's going to just be customary for your state. So if your state, depending upon what the transfer and recordation is for your state, you'll be responsible for those fees. And then the attorney, they're going to all have their own fees. So that just depends on how much the attorney wants to charge to do the settlement. I mean, I've seen some people where they do like a $500, sometimes it's $1,000, but that fee will vary by the attorney. So you'll have to, when you meet an attorney, you find out that normally what I do is this. So like if I'm looking for an attorney, if I find somebody that's investor friendly, I just ask them for their schedule sheet, and then I can see how much they charge for things. Any other questions? I'm looking here. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions for today. I'm looking here, but sometimes it's a little delayed. Okay, so that's it for today. Again, I hope you're getting value. Please invite your friends to the group. And any other questions that you have, please go ahead and post them, and I can come in and answer them. Okay, and bye-bye for now.